name is Sonali Doshi, and I'm the director of the Kennedy Political Union, American University's student-run, nonpartisan speakers bureau that has been bringing the most politically relevant speakers for over 50 years now. It is my honor to welcome you to tonight's event, KPU and WI Present, a conversation with Monica Lewinsky. To stay up to date with the rest of our events for the semester, follow at AUSG KPU on all platforms. Without further ado, it is my honor to introduce our moderator and speaker for the evening, SOC Professor Molly O'Rourke. Molly O'Rourke is an executive in residence in the School of Communication and also serves as director of the Master's Program in Political Communication. She has more than 20 years of experience in the field of public opinion research, most recently as a partner at the prestigious Hart research firm in Washington, D.C., where she has worked with a diverse portfolio of high-profile clients, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Human Rights Campaign, and NBC News. Earlier in her career, she worked in the U.S. Senate, for Emily's List, and as an analyst at the Center for Public Interest Polling at Rutgers University Eagleton Institute. A well-respected expert within the field of political communication, Professor O'Rourke previously co-wrote a monthly column about trends in public opinion and political behavior for The Hill, and has appeared as a polling expert on a number of television programs, including NBC Nightly News and Hardball with Chris Matthews. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Our guest for tonight is Monica Lewinsky. Monica Lewinsky is a social activist in the battle against online harassment, advocating for a safer social media environment. As a public speaker, writer, and contributor to Vanity Fair, she addresses a range of topics from survival and resiliency to digital reputation and equality. Thrown into the center of a legal, political, and media firestorm in 1998, she unwillingly went from being an entirely private individual to a public figure on the global stage at just 24 years old. In 2014, after a decade-long self-imposed retreat from public life, Monica authored an essay for Vanity Fair titled Shame and Survival, in which she overlapped personal experiences and cultural observations regarding the shift towards what Professor Nicholas Mills calls a culture of humiliation. The acclaimed piece received over 2 million unique views online, was nominated for a National Magazine Award, and became an entry point for her to begin a process she describes as taking back her narrative and giving a purpose to her past. As someone who experienced shame and humiliation perpetuated through social media and on the widest scale, Ms. Lewinsky saw that she could amplify public discourse about online harassment and work to effect positive change. Her survival, despite the odds, is a compelling and inspiring story of resiliency as she continues to be an example of how people can overcome even the most difficult situations. Please join me in welcoming Monica Lewinsky.
Thank you so much, Sonali, and Monica Lewinsky, welcome.
Hi, thank you. I'm really delighted to be with all of you virtually.
Thank you, and thank you so much for being here. I wanted to start, I guess, when I learned that you were going to be coming for the event, it struck me that you fit into the category of famous people who we don't actually know. You're a very busy woman. You have a lot of different initiatives going on that require you to wear many different hats. You're an anti-bullying advocate. You're a social activist. You've recently served as an executive producer of the documentary 15 Minutes of Shame. Sonali mentioned you're a contributing writer at Vanity Fair, and I'm sure there are many other things you're involved in. And so I wanted to start by just asking you a little bit about your progression into those roles. Your part, and I emphasize part of your story, is well known to us and probably not fully accurately known to us. But what was your journey from where you are, from there to where you are now, and how you became an advocate for social change?
Right. I often will find myself just having a moment of gratitude for how much things have changed in my family. We have a joke about, we call it the wow folder, like these things that happen sometimes, not the 1998 wow kind of things, but a positive wow. And so it's been a very unexpected process and journey, as to use your word, I think, in terms of finding myself being a young adult, certainly not starting my professional life out in the way that anybody had expected, and to start to try to understand what my new normal was in in the late 90s and early 2000s, and just it didn't work. It didn't, like, me as a public person just didn't work. And so what I ended up doing was in 2005, I moved to London, and I went to graduate school at the London School of Economics, and I got a master's in social psychology. And I think that the hope there was to kind of both build a scaffolding upon which I could have this new identity. And also at the same time, I was returning to some of what had interested me in college. So my plan had been to become a forensic psychologist. So I got very derailed. But so I kind of came out of graduate school thinking, okay, here we go. Now is Monica 2.0. And that actually was a very jarring time for me to come to realize. It was in that period where I couldn't find a job, or somebody wanted to hire me for the wrong reasons, that I really started to see a whole other layer around what it was that I had lost from 1998. And so from this kind of, sort of depths of despair, I eventually also, started to do a lot of personal healing and personal work. And I also, at the same time, noticed that the world was changing. And what had happened to me from having made a mistake was now happening to people who weren't making mistakes, and there was no roadmap for it. So it was, I sort of tried to climb a new mountain and got pushed back down. And eventually, really, it was, thanks to my editor at Vanity Fair and David Friend and Graydon Carter, who was the main editor at the time, writing Shame and Survival in 2014, having that published, was a whole new kind of turning the page for me in some ways. So I don't know if that answer. I say this a lot. Everybody should just get used to me going, did that make sense? Is that what you were?
It does. So it does make a lot of sense. In listening to your advocacy, preparing to talk to you tonight, one of the most compelling aspects, I think, of your platform is the incredible power that lies in the concept of being able to call out something, especially when that's done collectively, and act together to call something out. And there's real social value around things like boycotts that hold corporations accountable, or protests against policies that we think are unfair and we want to see changed. And so there are grassroots movements like Me Too that confront individuals and institutions that use their power or abuse their power, often silently. But your activism really centers on when action turns into more of a cancel culture. And, we've seen sort of the emergence of flash mob reaction to an individual that sort of shames them, often with, sometimes brutal consequences. You talk personally about how the suicide death of Taylor Clementi, a Rutgers student whose roommate outed him on social media, and you actually said he was humiliated to death. And you've obviously thought a lot about this and studied it from a range of perspectives. I guess I wanted to ask you, how do you think we protect the former, that is like the positive protest and the petitioning for change, while we avoid the latter, which is the shaming and the humiliation? So can you help us think about, what are some of the boundaries around that?
Right. Sure. Yeah. No, it's a good question, and it's something, as you mentioned, or Sonali mentioned, that I was an executive producer on this documentary, 15 Minutes of Shame, that came out late last year, and we struggled with this enormously, because it's very easy to sort of just denounce shame, but then, as you're mentioning, there are all of these ways that we sort of use shame for change, and that they are and they're very powerful methods often for groups that have been marginalized too. So I think that we don't quite 100% know the answer. I think we're in the throes of as a society trying to find our way through this. I think that there are some big demarcations that we can make, which are, corporation versus individual, right? Already public individual versus private individual.
Mhm.
Someone who, and it's not to say someone who comes from a privileged life is going to somehow emotionally experience a public shaming differently. They won't. We all experience these emotional things the same way, but the consequences, what it means for someone to lose their job who, supports a family and for whom they won't be able to pay their rent or put food on the table is something very different than a sort of a punishment that comes to a public figure who has 6 houses. It means something. The consequences mean something different. And I think it is important for us to find our way, but both Roxane Gay and Kara Swisher use these terms around Roxane says consequence culture, and Kara Swisher talks about accountability culture. And I think that those are, this is kind of this trifecta of words of canceling and accountability and consequences. And for me, I think from my own experiences, what we tried to bring to the conversation in the film is it is so easy to lose context of a situation. It's so easy to have a knee-jerk reaction. And I think one of the downsides of social media is like, it's almost as if we're all these young kids, like toddlers who want attention and no one will listen to us. And someone listens to us and we're like, okay, now we won't shut up. Like we immediately just think that our opinions are so worth screaming out. So that's just where I think it is. I think it's important to kind of try to see the humanity in people, to wait a beat, to think about how you would want to be treated if it were you. And trying to remember that we don't know who this person was 5 minutes before they said or did whatever it is that is blowing up, and really trying to understand that context better.
Thank you. I want to circle back around to that because you talk a little bit about a compassion deficit that we have, and I think that's really important in helping to establish some of those boundaries that you talked about. You've got this trifecta of cancel culture, which doesn't seem very good, accountability culture, which does seem good, and how do we know the difference when we're going through it and our emotions are high? So I want to circle back to that, but first I just wanted to pick up on one thing that you mentioned, specifically, I guess, the role of technology. The internet was obviously a key to your story going viral. It was new at the time, and so kind of the shiny new object that we use to disseminate information, and now it's only been amplified really with social media, making that exponentially kind of faster and more dangerous. And you've talked a little bit about how social media can be weaponized. But it can also be a powerful and accessible tool for people who don't have a voice. And so I love in your advocacy work and your TED Talk, you kind of acknowledge that double-edged sword, and you say one guideline or one post that we should look at in making our decision about how we're going to act is to ask yourself the question, are you doing this only because you're having to interact with a screen and not with a real human being? And I wanted to see if you could just say a little bit more about that suggestion and how with these tools of technology, we don't lose that sort of human connection and really ability to relate to each other.
Sure. There's a, if there are any psych majors in the house, there's now, I think it's been around for a decade or so, but it's the online disinhibition effect. And I'm forgetting, sorry, to the guy who, I don't know, what do you discover an effect, name an effect, find an effect, whatever it is that they did. But it really is talking about how, so much of what we do is based on human connection of, like on Zoom, I'm reading your social cues. If I said something, I might be able to get a sense of like, oh God, I shouldn't have said that. That was, but we feel an emotion coming from someone. And we don't have that over a screen. And so I think not only are we not able to kind of take in that level of information as a processing, we're also, I think that we come to find some sort of a power in anonymity. I think there's been a lot of talk about teenagers, trying on different identities on social media as they're growing up. And I think we do that as adults too. It's not, it really is this like, oh, well, what does it feel like to be a total bitch, and go after somebody? Or what do those things feel like? Because they're not ways that we are normally. But I, circling back to what you were saying too, that there is an enormous power in social media. I mean, I think we look at Me Too 2.0. I was at lunch today, we were talking about the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. That couldn't have happened without social media. Or you think about the Women's March, this coming together in such a short amount of time. And so I think that all of those things really kind of contribute to ways that the internet is positive. We can't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Mm-hmm. Let me circle back around to that compassion deficit or empathy. You gave such an impressive TED talk.
Thank you. I worked harder on it than my master's thesis.
It showed. And in it, you made a very powerful appeal for us to consider and think about ways that we can proactively address this compassion deficit or this empathy crisis that's being facilitated really by technology, and being able to be very impulsive with reactions and to be very personal with our reactions. And I'm wondering how you think we deal with that as a society, but also as individuals. And I guess I just wanted to also kind of throw in our current context in the middle of a pandemic. I feel as though I've really give my students so much credit. I've noticed over the last 2 years, where we've often been on Zoom in class, that students seem to really recognize that there's a collective pain and struggle going on, and they're so much maybe more aware and supportive of each other. So if we have a class going on in Zoom and it's clear that a student is maybe really struggling with an answer, or you see other people, in the chat room posting, thanks for sharing that, or that was a great insight, or somebody who speaks up for the first time in class, you see applause going up. And students were supportive of each other like that before the pandemic, but I'm wondering if you think that this experience of the pandemic might be an opportunity, I guess, for us to kind of reconsider our connections with each other, since we're all sort of suffering from a very common set of experiences of isolation and grief.
Yeah. I would love to hope so. I think that's, the better part of humanity. It is, I think that I think we are seeing that, and we often see that, with crisis. I think about, I lived in New York. I was in New York living downtown on 9/11 below 14th Street. And so I think about what the community was like after that. You would say hello to people more. You might hug a stranger. That I think that there's sort of these, that we do kind of step up. And I think it's really wonderful that you've seen that in your classes, and particularly because, we have focused so much in the past 2 years on the physical health crisis and not on the mental health crisis, that this physical health crisis is worsening. So, it gives me hope that young people are being more compassionate, as you're talking about, and I hope that happens. I think we've kind of unfortunately seen a lot of everything, and it's been a pretty politically messy few years as well, where internet and lack of compassion has been around.
Mm-hmm. I just think perhaps that shared experience of vulnerability and being afraid for our future, afraid for our physical health, has maybe presented us with a moment where we can really reconnect with kind of that collective, that collective sense of being vulnerable and knowing that we have to be supportive of each other. In listening to your TED Talk, there was something really made me shiver, and you are kind of dramatic and ask who in the audience hasn't made a mistake at the age of 22 that they really didn't want people to know about, much less the whole world to be consumed with. And for me, when I was listening to that, I thought, what a clarifying question for all of us to ask ourselves. And of course, in your situation, your moment at 22 years old became very, very public, which you describe as humiliating and also very isolating. And I think a lot of us can understand why it felt humiliating for you, but say a little bit more about the isolation, because it was such a public moment, and to feel so isolated when it's so public and so inescapable. And if you think this is kind of a common experience for victims of shaming, that not just the humiliation, but the isolation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the isolation happens in my instance, and I think this happens for other people too. The isolation happened on two tracks. So it was both a physical isolation that comes from the shaming and the hiding, and then there's the emotional isolation that happens and that arises from a feeling, in some ways, of frustration of being seen, but not being seen for your true self. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people, shamings or not shamings, but I think we have people in all different, communities in our world today that go through these various things of sort of not being seen or accepted for who they actually are. And instead of being, I joke, like, I'm a social canvas, you just like, tell me a few things about your views on these things and I'll know whether or not, someone will like me or not like me, and so I think in that way, I do think, again, not to keep harping back to 15 minutes of shame, but in the process of, because we do interview some targets of online shamings, they were, these people experience the same thing. And I have often talked about, people will say to me, like, I had this thing happen, but of course it's not as bad as what you went through. And I don't see it that way. It's not, there's no sort of, there's no like bar to hit. It's very binary for me. You either know what public humiliation is like or you don't. It is not about how much or how bad someone's humiliation was, because it is utterly devastating. It's devastating to see a version of you created and running away from you publicly that is not you. It's not who your family knows, not who your friends know. And that has a really enormous emotional cost to it.
You mentioned the documentary, the 15 Minutes of Shame, and I did want to ask about that, because one of the stories that you profile or feature in the documentary is, very near and dear for us, a series of events at AU with one of our Black student leaders, Taylor Dumpson, who became really the object of just kind of disgusting racial harassment. And ultimately, she won a lawsuit against the Daily Stormer, an online publication that really bullied and threatened her physical safety and caused her incredible anguish.
Still to today.
Still through today. So that presents one I guess, possible answer, a civil judgment. She, won in court, and it was a significant monetary fine. But I guess, what do you see as other solutions, short of civil judgment and taking people to court? And I guess specifically, I wanted to ask, when we're in the conversation about solutions, do you think there should be controls and restrictions on social media? Is that one of the solutions that we should be putting into the toolkit?
I think that we have not done a good enough job of being creative about the kinds of tools that we use on social media. I know that, I'm not really on Facebook anymore, but I'm very active on Twitter, and I'm on Instagram privately. And I see the efforts that are made to try to change this social landscape for people, but I still feel like we figured out how to get, a man on the moon. We've got holograms. Like, we've got to have better minds who are able to come up with better solutions. And of course, part of what's challenging is it's about human nature as well. We are all also responsible. So I think that there are ways that they can slow things down. One experience that people have when a shaming happens on social media is this avalanche feeling, which is really sort of a terrifying thing of if you were to, like, put into physical form, think of every tweet was an orange, and you're having these oranges pelted at you. You are going to cower. That is how you feel. And I think that there could be, like, one thing I just thought about for a while is just, once something triggers a bar of being talked about a lot in an algorithm, the same algorithm that would put it on a trending topic, isn't there a way to sort of, if this is a private person, to slow down? So you're not taking away someone's right to speak or right to say, but if you're slowing down what happens, I think it diffuses a mob sense. It diffuses everybody coming together to rush forward to judgment. And in Taylor's case, she's an extraordinary young woman and very strong. And I think what was very interesting to us as producers, and Max Joseph, who's on Catfish, if anybody watched Catfish, he's the director of the film. Something we talked about a lot was this fact that Taylor did absolutely nothing wrong. Nothing. There was nothing to misinterpret. She didn't tell a joke that she thought was funny and was offensive, or did something privately that became public. She did nothing, and she still experienced this kind of shaming. And I think that Dr. Safia Noble talks about this in Algorithms of Oppression. And I think one of the things we see with what has happened online with race is that this is, these are the ghosts of the future to come, the ghosts to come. And I think that it has often been worse for people of color and for women and the LGBTQ community, and then it starts to seep into other communities. And so I got lost. I'm sorry.
No, so just in terms of the solutions, there are technology solutions, there are
yes.
solutions.
Yes, and I think we need all of them.
Right.
I think we just take something narrow, like, or just Section 230 is not narrow, but you look at something like image-based abuse, or what we more commonly call revenge porn, and you think, how is this remotely possible that somebody can take a picture of you and post an intimate photo of you without your permission, and no one has to be forced to take it down legally? How is that remotely possible in this country? It is. So I think it is. It's legal. It's the social media companies. It's society as a whole.
And so you talk about those kind of policy prescriptions or things that we could do, safeguards to put in place. But one of the things I was also really struck with in watching the documentary is your appeal for all of us to kind of impose a consciousness or a discipline on ourselves to not become just another one of the destructive stone throwers, right? Because you get caught up, you potentially can get caught up in the moment as well and express your
Sure, me too.
Or your outrage in an inappropriate and destructive way. Do you have any thoughts for us?
Sure. I mean,
prevent ourselves from going down the continuum.
I think that there are a few pieces here. And so one is, and everybody maybe knows this already, but just to be super clear, one of the reasons we talk about this and look at this is because of the algorithms. So because of the algorithms and because of the money that is behind, ad-based clicking. So every time we're clicking on something, it's like buying a newspaper, and you're basically signaling to a content company, yeah, I'll order this again. I'll order this next time. So we are all part of creating the algorithm that is out there. It's not just, these bad people are trying to make money off of us. I mean, there is an element of that, but we do have a responsibility there. And I think that I think like most every, social behavior that we change, it is rarely a switch that gets flipped on or off. It is something that starts in increments. And for me, what I do of just trying to, I try to live by example in this arena, is I watch what I click, like in terms of, I sort of have started to train myself after, maybe a third article on the same gossipy topic. I'm like, I kind of go, okay, do I really need to read one more thing on so-and-so's divorce? It's just, so I think it's just starting to try to be mindful that way and mindful of what you're clicking on. And also, just sort of circling back to something you were saying about the internet being positive, is also using your click for good. So it can be, I think it can sound very hokey or Pollyanna-ish, this idea of like, oh, just being supportive of someone can really make a difference. I am telling you it can. I think people feel so alone. And as we were saying before, to feel so exposed and yet not be seen, and what it can mean to somebody. To, you don't always have to be the person to go in and interrupt a bullying cycle, because that's not safe for everybody. And everybody's not built for that, emotionally or physically sometimes. But we can all reach out to a target, whether it's in person or send a text or post something online. It could just be an emoji if you don't know what to say, just something. And it not only does it online when you're, if it's in a Twitter cyclone or whatever, it's interrupting this algorithm and the cycle of outrage, and it makes a difference to the target, and it makes them feel less alone. And so those are the kinds of things that, the more we're doing those kinds of things little by little by little, I hope it starts to shift.
So that's great, and you're talking really from your own personal experience that that kind of support really does make a difference to somebody who's experiencing it at the time. And so I do want to make sure we have a lot of questions from students.
Okay.
I want to make sure we get to them, but I just wanted to ask one more question, or maybe give you an opportunity to say more about your own journey that you started with, from being what you describe as you felt like a victim. You called yourself patient zero of kind of our modern era of public bullying, and you have become a professional woman who's reclaimed her narrative, reclaimed agency over her story. And I think there are a lot of people, a lot of young people, students on the call who I imagine will struggle with some of those same issues, maybe not at that level, but with feelings of kind of control and disempowerment. And I'm wondering if you have any advice from them based on your story, guidance to offer them when they are feeling those same things.
Yeah, I think one thing that that we probably can all agree on is that we're all going to make a mistake in our life, at least one. At least one mistake that is going to have some kind of what we will consider a capital C consequence. And so it 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 really is, I think it's valuable to try to get comfortable with the idea. It's sort of like a seatbelt. You wear a seatbelt hoping you're not going to get in an accident. But if you do get in an accident, it's a preventative measure to having more harm. And one thing that I don't know if this is helpful or not, but I think from the outside, it can look like I had this sort of, linear shift in my life and that everything changed and I reclaimed I just went and reclaimed my narrative. And that is so not what happened. It is really hard work. It can be done, and I think it's really important for people to try to, if they're suffering or going through a hard time, to try to remember that this is one period in their life. And I promise you, maybe except for my parents, there was not a person alive who would have thought I would have been able to move forward in this way that I have, and to actually be somebody who's made a positive contribution in any way to society. Nobody thought that. And it really is just about just holding on. It is holding on. I can't tell you how many nights I would go to bed crying, thinking, praying I would just not wake up, And so I think we all go through different experiences of that. But what happens every time you get through it one time, the next time one of those waves come, somewhere lodged in your experience, or remember me, me saying it, you can get through it. It will shift. It doesn't mean it's going to instantly get better, but it will start to change and you will grow from it. And I say it in my TED Talk, but I really believe it, that you can have a different ending to this story that someone else has written for you. So
thank you for being so honest. I'm really struck with that. It's inspiring, but it's also your candor and your honesty about it not being a linear path and how difficult it truly has been. That it's not a story that just magically turned around, that it's involved a lot of pain, a lot of growth on your part. And I just think that's so important for students to hear, so that when they're experiencing it, they know that they're on your path.
I think that's, you can feel very alone in these experiences, but the truth is almost all of us have gone through them, in various ways. So,
I wanted to see if I could ask I have some questions coming in from our audience.
Okay.
So I'll start with a question from Rosalia, and she asks, how do you think your experience would have been different had social media and the various societal reckonings that come with social media, like the Me Too movement, existed in the way it does today back in the late 90s? So do you think that the social media potentially would have offset some of the media attacks that you are receiving? It's hard to put yourself back in that position, but you must have given it some thought.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think that there's sort of two questions there, and then I also see where there's the bridge of the one question. And I think that things would be different. I don't know that they would be as different as people think they would be. And I'm not certain they would be quite as different if it were a young, charismatic, democratic president still. So I think we have seen some instances where that people have similarly been held accountable. But I don't know that we've come quite as far as we maybe think we do, or certainly I know Tarana Burke works tirelessly on trying to get us farther ahead. In terms of social media, where I think it would have been really beneficial to me I'm not sure how great it was. If you talk to my brother, he would probably, tell you a different story, but people would have had a sense of me, right? Somebody would have gone to what was my Facebook page or my Twitter page. and I just would have been slightly more human than I was in '98 with, anonymous sources talking about me. And I think that I would have maybe been able to hear the quiet support that I couldn't hear unless somebody sent me a letter, with a stamp, um, or yeah. So I think in those ways it might have been a little different, but it would have been really brutal in terms of the jokes and the memes, and but I maybe there would have been more support. I would hope now, that's a big reason I do a lot of what I do, is hoping that, someone else just doesn't have to suffer as much as I did. So
We have a question from Aiden who asks, has the fear and pressure that the media has given you over the years, how have you turned that into a positive that's helped you grow? I can imagine it was terrifying to the point of maybe even being paralyzing for a while. So how have you been able to adjust to that and leverage it into something positive?
I have chipped away at that fear and panic very slowly in the public eye. When I was working on my TED Talk, and I was working with somebody who was helping me, make sure that I was delivering the talk in the way that I thought I was in my head, so that I was, communicating in that way. One of the things she said to me, which I wrote at the top of my talk, was "This matters." And so for me, having something external that is like to go out and talk about that's not about me helps a lot. But the amount of preparation that I do to do media, whether it's a print interview, a podcast, do an online, or TV interview, the only way I can manage my PTSD is by over preparing. Even though you don't know what the questions are, but it's like I work with somebody to just, who has a news background. So I have to over prepare for that, because otherwise can get very paralyzed by the fear, and a panic of misspeaking or being made fun of, and how do I look? My looks were totally torn apart. So all of those things are kind of, pieces of my armor.
Mm-hmm.
To do that.
In that answer, you referenced PTSD,
Mm-hmm.
and a question from Lila. She asked, "I've heard you speak publicly in the past that you've been in therapy. What's one useful or helpful lesson that you've learned in therapy that you'd be comfortable sharing with us?"
The two that pop up, one was like a really simple thing my therapist said to me once, and some of you may have heard this or heard versions of it from other places, but it was, "Don't judge your insides by other people's outsides." And it really made a difference for me, to try to remind myself it's not always as it seems. But in terms of PTSD, I think one of the other, and my main therapist is a trauma psychiatrist, who's been in practice for I think 30 years. But so the first public talk I ever did was the Forbes 30 Under 30, and when I finished and I didn't pass out on stage and people didn't boo me, and which is sort of the bar of success for me at that time, I remember coming back to New York, my next therapy session, and sort of saying I didn't feel anything, I didn't fuck up, and it went okay, and I feel nothing. And she was saying that it takes a long time with trauma, a long time of things being different, for the psyche to sort of relax, to finally kind of take that in. And therefore, it's really important when you find yourself feeling triggered or traumatized in some way, to try to find what's the one way that it's different than what it's reminding you of. Mm-hmm. What's the one tiny, it could be the tiniest thing, or if you can come up with 5 things, but that recognition of, I find for me, what is helpful is I sort of mentally untangle and put things in different rooms. I did that this morning in my somatic therapy session. So it's like these things are feeling the same. This is happening now, but it's reminding me of what happened 20 years ago. So it's like I put this person in this room and that person goes in that room because they are separate. I'm not, what's happening today is not the same as 20 years ago. But you can start your body, your vagus nerve and your nervous system will respond that way that it is. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Jason asks, do you feel as though the fight against humiliation and cancel culture has been politicized to a detriment? So how do we make sure that humiliation and accountability aren't weaponized to serve an agenda? And I think what Jason means is a political agenda.
Right. I 100% think that that's a problem that we're going through. You were asking before about, what are some of the things I do? I had to, I found myself in the previous administration having to stop myself and kind of saying, okay, wait a minute. Why do I want to post a photo that's a very unattractive photo of someone that everybody else is posting that is making fun of their weight or something else? And there is so much anger that we just, but we have to find a different way to express it, because I do think it's been politicized, and I think that is caused one of the worst, ruptures and fractions in our political and social society than what we've seen in prior to my lifetime. So I'm 48, and I have not experienced what we're living through now, and it's terrifying. I find it terrifying. I don't know about other people, but I find it very scary. So
Christopher asks, has the media portrayal of you improved? If so, would you say that it's due to the revitalized image that you've cultivated of yourself? I mean, the hard work that you've really done? Or do you attribute that to a change in the way society thinks and talks about the kinds of issues that you face? We're in a different era now.
Right. I think it's both. I think that it's both. I think that, one of the things, and again, this is like where Twitter has helped me. I mean, my brothers finally had to acknowledge I'm funny. So, which is really a huge feat for me, let me tell you. My whole life, it's like, Monica, you're not as funny as you think you are. Like, I am funny. The world thinks I'm funny. So, but I think that something that has happened is I've been able to be seen for more of my true self. And so that has been because of some different avenues and platforms, because of the hard work, because of the hard choices I make of what I do and what I don't do. And I think the world is changing. I think that people are looking at things differently, and certainly re-examining what happened to me and several other women, in a decades period that were that were dehumanized in many ways and used as kind of like, social punching bags.
I am reading something that I want to pass on from Eva. She says, your TED Talk about shame changed my life.
Oh.
How have you seen shame, especially concerning sexuality and womanhood, evolve throughout your lifetime and your time in the public eye?
First of all, thank you for saying that, Ava. Those kinds of things help me keep going and do more, because all of this stuff is hard for me with my PTSD. But I think that, I think that we're seeing things, and maybe it's always been this way. I'm on a women's listserv, and I do still see a generational divide between like how we are looking at certain aspects of sexuality. I think one of the things that is, I think we have both, sexual orientation, and then also all of these things that kind of come around sex and womanhood. And, just like a small example that pops into my mind is, Google facilitating for their, female employees or women employees egg freezing, and so like sometimes what that means. But I think we are talking about it in ways that are more open, and we see that represented on TV more, in programs more, and that's really important. But I do still think women are, can be slut shamed still. Mm-hmm. So I do still think that we never see a woman recover as fast from a sexual public humiliation as we do a man still. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the story becomes about how soon can the man, not come back. Yeah, his comeback, Right. So, yeah.
I want to read another comment and question from Naomi. She says, first, her comment, thank you for being a role model to young women everywhere. And her question is, were you able to find support from others at the very beginning? And if not, how did you remain so strong? We talked a little bit earlier about how humiliation was accompanied by isolation. So where did you said your parents were incredibly, or your family was incredibly supportive. Did you find support in other places?
It was not for a while because of the legal situation. So I wasn't able to talk to any of my friends. And I actually, until March, when my best friend from college, Catherine, who I was just with, and her family yesterday at Disneyland, until after she testified, and she'd been living in Tokyo at the time, and they brought her back from Tokyo, and they took her laptop, and, and she testified, and she was, my age, 24. Our lawyers said that we could see each other if we promised not to talk about the case. And so that day always lived for me as a really important marker, because I knew, okay, I have one friend in the world. Like, I have at least one friend. And so it was really hard. It was really, my friends wrote to me and stuff, but the FBI was going through my high school, yearbooks, and literally asked everybody I went to grade school and high school with that I was friendly with, so I was a liability. And to talk to me was a liability, or it could be a liability to me, because this grand jury was seated in my name. So,
Henry has a question that kind of picks up a little bit on mental health impact. Mm-hmm. And says, obviously, you've had the experience, and do you have any advice for others who are the victims or targets of cyberbullying, how they can protect or try and preserve their mental health during something that feels so spiraling and so out of control?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this may seem obvious, but the very first thing, and to me, the most important message that I could get across to anybody who's a target of something like this is to not suffer in silence. So it is really important to tell a trusted someone. And because I think some of the worst things can happen when you're sort of stewing in your own humiliation. And that can be harder for men than for women. So I don't know if there's any non-binary research there, but I think there's, let me see if I'm trying to find the right way to say this. It's really important to invest in your relationships. And that can be hard for some people who are not neurotypical. But having those people in your life who can reflect back to you who you really are, not like keep mooring you back to who your true self is really important. And that again is like the seatbelt. And so it's we have to prepare for those kinds of things. That is an important part of human connection, and an important part in these situations. But I don't know that this kind of answers the question, but I think we're doing a better job at chipping away at the stigma of getting psychological help, mental health help. But there is no shame in getting help. There's no shame in getting help. There's no shame if medication is a route that you want to go on. There's no shame in any of that. And in fact, it is brave. It's brave to say you have a problem and brave to take care of yourself. So I don't know if that's helpful. Henry, sorry.
I think people will helpful in terms of proactive steps that you can take when you're feeling so maybe out of control of other aspects of what's happening.
I'm sorry, I want to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
There's, one thing to remember too, and you guys may have seen it before, is crisis text line. So there's, I'm trying to remember the number. Oh God, I think it's like, shit. Okay, maybe you guys can send it out later.
I think we can.
You probably have something.
We'll look at it and see if we can send it out.
Crisis text line is a really amazing. I know the woman who started it. I know people who are counselors on there. It is, or not counselors, but helpers on who answer the calls, who text back. So just reach out to someone. So
I know we're getting kind of near the end of our hour together, and Kaylin posted something in the chat about being forward-looking. We've done a lot of kind of looking back and what's happened in your story. But Kaylin asked, what are your next steps? How do you see yourself carrying your advocacy into the future and kind of future advocacy goals beyond all the ambitious things that you're already working towards?
I was also a producer on Ryan Murphy's impeachment series, the American Crime series, and through that process, I got a first look deal with 20th Television. So I'm in the process of trying to develop scripted dramas and start a different career that's still about storytelling, is another way to kind of highlight and amplify the kinds of stories and messaging that feels important to me while also being entertaining. And that's one way, and sort of connected to that, which I think I'm hopefully gonna try to get back to. Before the pandemic, 3 years before the pandemic, every year for Bullying Prevention Month, I worked with an ad agency to do a big anti-bullying campaign for October's Bullying Prevention Month. And so we made 3 different PSAs. One of them was actually even nominated for an Emmy. And so I'm hoping to be able to do that again this year. So that's another way forward, and just trying to amplify other voices of people. But yeah.
Monica Lewinsky, thank you so much.
Molly,
a great way to sort of end our discussion with you. But I just really want to genuinely thank you for your honesty, and I think that's what's inspired our students the most, is your willingness to be very open and to tell your story in a way that is relatable and that other people can find strength in. So thank you so much.
Thanks. Great questions, yours and everybody. So thank you so much.
Well, I want to reiterate that. Thank you so much. That brings tonight's event to a close. Thank you all so much for joining us. Before we end, I'd also like to extend, again, a big thank you to our moderator, Professor Molly O'Rourke, our co-sponsor, Women's Initiative, and our guest, Monica Lewinsky. Your advocacy and words are truly inspiring to all of us. Please make sure to follow at AUSG KPU to keep up to date with all of our events. Thank you again, and have a great evening. Good night.
Thank you.